Let's look now at calculating a working interest and a net revenue interest in an oil and gas lease. I want you to understand what the impact is of the royalty in the oil and gas lease, and what the impact that can have on the success of the company or the success of the venture. So you need to understand what the working interest is in an oil and gas lease, both before there is an oil and gas lease and after there is an oil and gas lease. So we're going to look at what the interests are of the mineral owner, or also known as the lessor, and the interest of the oil and gas company, also known as the lessee. And in law school, they taught us a mineral owner rhymes with lessor, oil and gas company rhymes with lessee. So that might be something you can use that will help you, because you'll hear these terms bandied about: lessor, lessee, lessee, lessor, and it can get really complicated unless you kind of have a way to keep it straight in your mind. So the other terminology I want to go over besides lessor and lessee is what we call the working interest, abbreviated here as WI, and the net revenue interest in an oil and gas lease. When we talk about the working interest, we're talking about if we drill an oil and gas well, who is going to pay for the cost of the well? Usually it's an oil and gas company. But if a mineral owner decides that they want to drill on their own land, there's no oil and gas company involved, there's no oil and gas lease involved, that mineral owner has a 100% interest, in the working interest in that property before there is a lease on the property. The net revenue interest, that means the working interest minus any burdens. That means minus any royalty payments or overriding royalty payments that you need to make, what we call the burdens. The net revenue interest is going to be 100% minus whatever the royalty is. But since there's no lease, there's really no royalty. So the mineral owner, the lessor, would be entitled to 100% of the working interest. That means they're going to pay all the bills for the drilling of that well, and they are going to be entitled to a 100% net revenue interest because they don't have to pay any burdens. So before the lease, the mineral owner owns both 100% of the working and 100% of the net revenue interest. Before there is a lease, the oil and gas company, who will be the lessee, but before the lease there is no lease, the oil and gas company owns 0% of the working interest and 0% of the net revenue interest. So that is what it is anytime there is no lease on the property. If that landowner wants to drill a well on his or her land, they're going to have to pay for 100% of the cost, but they're going to get a 100% net revenue interest. Okay, so I want to go over something that we call in the law what we call the grand bargain. Because what happens after there is an oil and gas lease? After there's an oil and gas lease, what changes is the lessor gives to the oil and gas company 100% of their working interest. So after the lease, the mineral owner or the lessor owns 0% of the working interest because they're giving 100% of it to the oil and gas company. And what are they getting in return? What they're getting in return is a royalty or a fraction of the production. So this is the way it works. Let's take, for example, what used to be a common lease royalty fraction, which is a 1/8. And let me just demonstrate how this works. And we're going to pretend like these are all nice, neat, even squares here. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So if we give 1/8 to the royalty owner, we say, okay, royalty owner, if you give us 100% of your working interest, we're going to give you 1/8 share of production. So the question you'll hear is, is this fair? Is it fair for the oil and gas company to get 100% of the working interest, and for the person that actually owns the mineral interest to only get a small fraction of whatever their production is going to be. So the person that owns the lease, or the mineral owner, is going to get a 1/8 royalty here, and the oil and gas company is going to get the remaining 7/8 here. So that's how it's going to be split. Now, is this fair? And I think the answer is yes, because keep in mind, if you want to drill an oil and gas well, it's going to cost you up about $6 million right now. It can be less, but pretty much the going rate is at least $6 million now. So if that well is a dry hole, who pays for the cost of the dry hole? And it's the oil and gas company. The mineral owner, the royalty owner here, does not have to pay anything. So because the oil and gas company is taking all of the risk, and they're saying, look, royalty owner, if there is no production, you don't get anything. But if there is production, you don't have to pay for the cost of the well, but you'll get a 1/8 royalty. So that means that the net revenue interest of the lessor, because we've taken an oil and gas lease now, of the lessor after the lease is going to be 1/8. And that leaves the oil and gas company's net revenue interest as 100% minus the 1/8. Okay? So we know 1/8 plus 7/8 is going to be the 8/8. So we take the 8/8, we minus the 1/8, that leaves the oil and gas company with this 7/8 interest. Now, if we want to convert this to decimals, it's as simple as taking this 1/8, 1 divided by 8 equals a 0.125. So that's a 0.125. And then if we look at the decimal for 7/8, again, all we're doing is taking the 7, dividing it by 8, and that's going to give us a 0.875, or an 87.5%. So that means after the oil and gas company pays their burdens, this 1/8, they're going to get a 0.875 net revenue interest. That's going to be their gains. And typically we want to get at least a 78% net revenue interest for the venture to be profitable, for us to engage in this oil and gas well. So you see, the lower we can make this royalty payment, the higher the net revenue interest is going to be for the oil and gas company. And again, you're just doing simple fractions here. If the mineral owner gets a 1/8, then that leaves the oil and gas company with a 7/8. Okay, so now let's take a different fraction. Let's say that if we used a 3/16 instead of a 1/8. So let's say the royalty here was 3/16. So what that would mean, what that would look like in our graph, is if we took these 8s, and now we're going to divide them in half to make them 16ths. So this is going to be divided in half, this is going to be divided in half, this is divided in half, and again, we're imagining these are all neat squares and these lines are perfectly straight. So if I give them a 3/16, you can see that is 1, 2, 3/16 here. So you can see the mineral owner's interest is slightly larger than it was when it was 1/8. So what the net revenue interest is going to be for the lessor is going to be this 3/16. 3/16 net revenue interest after the lease. Okay? And that's going to leave the oil and gas company with the remaining 13/16. Okay? And all we're doing is taking this 100% minus the 3/16. So if the 100% was 16/16, which is 1, then we're going to deduct from that 3/16, and that's going to give us 13/16. That is what the oil and gas company's interest would be. Now, if we want to know what that decimal is, again, we're just going to look at 13 divided by 16, the balance left, that's going to be a 0.8125 net revenue interest for the oil and gas company, or an 81.25% net revenue interest. When it was 1/8, it was 87%. Now we're down to 81%. So you can see that it decreases, the net revenue interest for the oil and gas company decreases the higher the royalty goes. Now we can do this all day long. We can say, well, what if it's a 1/4 net revenue interest, or a 1/4 royalty fraction in the oil and gas lease? That's going to leave the oil and gas company with a 3/4, or 0.25, 0.75. That's all you're doing. So this all works great, unless you have an owner that owns less than 100%, or the example we're going to show you now is if the interest of this royalty owner is pooled. So when we talk about pooling, what we mean is the state conservation laws or regulatory agencies designate how many wells can be on any given piece of property. And for, let's say this is a gas well. Let's say it says that you can only have one well for every 640 acres. So this is our lessor here. And lessor owns 160 acres out of this 640. Let's say they have a 3/16 lease. Okay, this is what I want to show you, is how then we get these decimals, these wacky looking decimals on our division order. And the calculation for that is simply the net acres owned by the landowner, the net acres, divided by the total unit acres. So the state says we can only have one well per 640 acres. That's a 640 acre unit. So we're going to take the net acres and we're going to divide it by the unit acres. And we're going to multiply that by whatever this royalty fraction is. So in this case, it's going to be a 3/16. So if we take, and that's going to equal your decimal interest that's going to appear on the DO pay sheet. So if we look at this one, the net acres is 160, and the gross acres, or the acres in the unit, is 640. I can just look at this chart right now and tell you that's 1/4. So I'm going to multiply 1/4 times this 3/16. So if we do the fraction, we're going to say 1/4 times 3/16, and that's going to give us 0.25 times 0.1875, and let's see what that comes out to. It's going to be a 0.25 times 0.18, sorry, 0.25 times 0.1875. And so the decimal interest for this owner that has a 3/16 lease royalty fraction in 160 acres is going to be this 0.046875. And that's how you get these crazy decimals. Usually they go out to 8 decimal places. Okay, so what I want you to keep in mind now, sometimes some people think about, when we talk about working interest, they think about what's on the JIB deck, or the joint interest billing deck. That's what the working interest look like. And for the net revenue interest, that's what we'll see on the division order pay sheet, which is also known as a division order deck. That's where we would get this 0.046875 if that royalty is not the only lease. So in this case, we're going to have to take this lease, this lease, this lease, and this lease, and that's going to reduce the 3/16 to this 0.046875. Okay. So I'm going to continue to do these types of presentations. I just want to get everybody familiar with the calculations that are typically used in oil and gas exploration and development, and I hope that this was helpful for you.